So it's not the optimal situation, but we've all been in situations where sadly our internet has failed us, and we'll just do the best and we'll move on to our next presenter, hoping that Salimah can come back and hold her presentation in the end of the session.
Right, I've written to her. Okay. Let's see what happens.
Okay. So this is not really what we planned, but are you guys okay to start a presentation?
Sure.
Brilliant.
Sure.
I will mute myself, and when you say next, I will click forward.
Okay.
If I can.
Okay, good afternoon everyone, and thank you so much for joining in London, what is a absolutely sweltering day. Myself and my co-author Nithya Joseph are here today to present a paper called Credit Where It's Due, and we speak on behalf of many other co-authors who are listed here as other institutions, and this is part of a kind of wider research project that we're both part of. Our paper today explores microfinance in Tamil Nadu in South India in the current COVID-19 crisis. Microfinance has long been touted and promoted as a means of affording poor rural households with the means to cope in a crisis and also to build longer term resilience. And this has been suggested in light of the current COVID-19 pandemic as well. And a recent World Bank report, for example, argues that, quote, financial inclusion, access to and basic use of financial services can reduce poverty, increase resilience, and improve the lives of the poor, women in particular. And this is in contrast to, according to this report, quote, informal methods which can be costlier, riskier, and may lead to abuse and perpetuate informality. So our paper takes as its starting point this kind of premise or this idea that's long been promoted in the literature, and explores financial inclusion through the most common form of financial inclusion, which is microcredit, in its current role in the COVID-19 pandemic and related economic crisis in Tamil Nadu, South India. We, in order to do this, draw on telephone interviews that we've done really quite recently with respondents across 3 villages in Tamil Nadu in the eastern kind of coastal districts. And beyond kind of more common studies about microfinance, what we're really looking at in our case, as the paper goes on to explore, is the absence of microfinance. In this kind of key moment of its promise, it's been fairly absent, and we want to understand what that means and what that looks like. So could you put the next slide on, please? Thank you. So understanding COVID-19 in India, just a brief bit of context. So after 2 months of ignoring the COVID-19 crisis, which was kind of late January, early February, February and early March. On the 24th of March this year, India's right-wing populist Prime Minister Narendra Modi put the whole country on lockdown with only 4 hours notice. And this resulted in the exodus of millions, tens of hundreds of millions of migrant workers across the country back to their natal villages, and represented, quote, the most visible stigmata of the profound health, economic and social crisis which poor Indians face. And that's from a paper by one of our other co-authors, Isabelle Guérin. The sudden halting of industries left millions of households without income for months on end, and the emerging evidence from various bits of research suggests that India's patchwork welfare program of food distribution, public works and everything else has not been sufficient to help people cope with the crisis. Next slide, please. So the question we ask firstly in this paper is, how do we understand the COVID-19 crisis from a political economy perspective? For this, we first went back to famine literature, which kind of peak of this literature was around the 1980s, early 1980s. So we have here on this slide a framing from Agarwal, which is one of many such framings, and what it really shows is the kind of different stages a particular household goes through, one after the other, starting at the top, in a context of famine. But in starting with this literature, the first thing we found was that because of the onset of neoliberalism that's taken place across the global south and in India since this literature was prevalent, the first 2 sources of kind of coping in this framework no longer really apply. So because of the particular transition that has happened in India, where you have 94% of the population working in the informal economy, and you have a transition to industrial and services sector growth without job creation. The idea of diversifying sources of income is not readily available. That was particularly true in COVID-19 because of the economic shutdown. We also found that drawing on communal resources because of privatization, processes of land privatization, wasn't something that was there. So we really start with the third step of the kind of famine framework. We also found that there wasn't really much work trying to understand how famine relief, or the concept of famine relief, has structurally transformed from the pre or early neoliberal era to the current era. And that's why our paper really looks at credit, because one of the kind of underlying arguments we make here is that in this crisis, a key form of state support with very inadequate state provisioning, as you'll see later in the paper, has been credit. Reliance on either state credit or reliance on the fact that liquidity and local credit markets will thrive even in moments where the state retreats with its kind of traditional forms of relief, which are eroded. We also focus particularly on the concept of vulnerability and trying to understand within this coping crisis how different households are able to cope. And we look here to Robert Chambers' work on vulnerability, seeing it as a dynamic concept which doesn't capture a snapshot of poverty, but rather understands poverty as a process, understands the processes, by which people move in and out of poverty. And in that regard, we adopt a multidimensional approach and look in particular to caste, class, and gender, particularly to gender, drawing on recent feminist political economy work about depletion, to the gendered harms and the gendered processes of depletion linked to social reproduction that go with microfinance debt burdens, which is kind of linked to our larger project. Sorry, could you click, Alex? Yeah, thank you. So the second point here is crisis ordinary. Just briefly on this, one of the points we really wanted to come to in this paper, or kind of start with really, is that the crisis, as it were, the COVID crisis, isn't a sudden moment. We don't really kind of agree with this idea of the binary it represents between pre-crisis and crisis. In fact, what the work of two of our co-authors, Isabelle and Venkat, shows from this region is, crisis has been a much longer term process, of which COVID-19 is just one moment. And so for that, we draw on Lauren Ballant and Rangasamy. And then finally, in terms of processes and dimensions, and to kind of bring this all together, we look at COVID-19 in the context of this crisis ordinary concept, looking to understand how long-term processes of vulnerability, understood through caste, class, and gender, shape responses to the crisis, paying attention to gender depletion. And in looking at responses to the crisis, we focus here on microfinance and local credit networks as what we argue being one of the key forms of relief that exist in the current era. Next slide, please. So just briefly on microfinance in Tamil Nadu, since at least the 1990s, the original subsidized not-for-profit microfinance model that began across the world has been replaced by a commercialized version, and India, Tamil Nadu is no exception to this. And this is in a broader context of neoliberal restructuring of development generally, where the main justification was really that early microfinance models relied on heavy state subsidies. And so globally, we've moved to commercial models and now increasingly models where commercial banks play a large role. So in Tamil Nadu, as in other parts of India, the initial NGO model, which was through self-help groups, which is a kind of community collective form of microcredit, has been replaced transformed into a for-profit self-help group model, or disappeared altogether in a move to disempower civil society at the state, national and national level in the past 15 years. That draws on work again from our co-author Isabelle Guérin. Yeah, final bullet point, responses to COVID-19, what has happened so far. In this context, we can look at what's happening in Tamil Nadu. In March of this year, the Reserve Bank of India, which is the kind of national state bank, allowed a 3-month moratorium on loan repayments. This was initially just limited to banks, but microfinance companies have applied to the Reserve Bank of India to also be eligible for this moratorium. And they were allowed to freeze loan repayment collections, and they've also stopped issuing new loans, including emergency loans. And this moratorium, as we speak, has been extended to the end of August. So we don't know what's going to happen after that. Initial evidence, this is the next slide, I think. Yeah, thank you. Initial evidence does suggest that not all companies have been complying with the rules of the moratorium. So these are just two headlines from kind of different news sources in India, but you can find this quite easily. In many regions, including Tamil Nadu, companies have been asking women to repay. There's a loophole also in the Reserve Bank of India's policy, which means that even though microfinance companies are halting repayments, they are focusing on collecting the missed interest payments once repayment starts. Furthermore, as part of a national COVID-19 aid package, which was announced by the finance minister, this included the doubling in value of collateral-free loans to self-help groups from 1 million to 2 million rupees. So there is a kind of focus here on self-help groups, commercialized self-help groups as a form of relief. But because of the disappearance of the NGO self-help group model, the effectiveness of such measures to the more commercial version of self-help groups we see today is quite elusive. This means basically that microfinance companies are largely protected, but the indebted that we study in this paper are losing access to what is apparently a crisis remedy at a point of material crisis. And so this is further exacerbating the complex household dynamics of social reproduction. So we now turn to the kind of more empirical side of the paper, and for this I turn to my co-author Nithya Joseph.
Next slide, please. And so I'll present a little bit about the phone-based surveys that we've been doing in 3 villages in Tamil Nadu, where a large amount of the population works either in brick kilns, or they migrate to cut sugarcane, or in local agriculture, or the young population works in nearby towns and in shops and jobs like this. And so we try to understand what has happened now at this moment, where people who've migrated have returned, people who are working locally can't commute to their work, and also what has happened to local agriculture, where everyone has come back now looking for jobs that were already scarce and already very low paying. And so we've spoken to 50 participants, all at least once, in the middle of doing a second round, but to some key informants up to 6 times. And what we've been trying to design the questions to specifically ask questions to respondents to understand people who are microfinance loan borrowers, what their experience has been, or somebody who's been working and migrating for a particular purpose, what their experience has been. And so what we understand is that there has been some relief from the state. India and Tamil Nadu specifically has a good system of public distribution, food ration supply, and so people have been getting some additional free rice and a small quantity of lentils and palm oil without charge. There have been a lot of COVID-specific cash transfers announced, but people we spoke to only could avail of one, and a very small amount. The National Employment Guarantee Act also offered some labor to households here, but again, a small number of days, only 5 or 6 out of the 100 promised. And beyond this, the fact that all government healthcare is only reaching COVID patients at the moment. Everyone seeking healthcare for anything else needs to seek expensive private care, and so they are borrowing also to be able to do this.
5 minutes left. 5 minutes.
Next slide, please.
Thank you.
And next slide, please. So then to talk quickly about these self-help groups, as Nithya was saying, that it's a complicated situation where there used to be a lot of NGO-facilitated self-help groups with a really interesting model where they allowed groups of women to get low-cost loans from the bank. So you would get loans at 12% per annum, which is lower than the 30% charged by private microfinance. But then these groups have largely eroded, but a few such remain, which are mostly, and these groups are mostly upper caste women who were able to save and manage in this way. And so we see that now the loans that the government has been pushing, in only one of our 3 villages do any of these self-help groups exist. And in the village that they do exist, only 8 out of 350 self-help group members receive loans. And these were only 4 people who owned shops and could send pictures of their shop, and 4 people who owned cows. And so they're very much looking at asset-backed lending in this relief. and the women who got these loans received £500, whereas the promised cash transfers to other poor women was £5 for 3 months, and this hasn't been received. So this is the disparity between how loans are, how credit is, how aid is concentrated in the form of credit, and then we show that it's not reaching the people who need it most. Next slide. Meanwhile, microfinance institutions, which are set out to empower poor women, what we see here is at this moment of crisis, they're completely absent in terms of offering help. They normally have a provision of a small emergency loan, but this has not been offered at all. And there's also significant stress due to the fact that they have outstanding loans, though they've been paused, interest is accruing for every month. And so people are worrying already, how will they pay when the moratorium no longer exists? And even with the moratorium, microfinance loan officers still coming to the village and pushing them, saying, you know, you have to pay interest, and you will even have to pay interest on the interest. So people are really scared because they don't know what the extent of this debt is going to be. And also they are, microfinance staff are threatening them, saying that you won't be able to borrow from us again in the future. And this is a serious threat because people are relying on being able to, all this time juggling microfinance loans, borrowing one to repay the other. So suddenly if someone is saying that you can't have this loan, this is worrying. And two things on this is, one is that the loan officers themselves explain that they are facing a lot of, they say the word is torture. They're saying we're being tortured in the head office. And so this is why we're here asking you to pay. And so what this leads to is that people borrowing more expensively from anyone they can borrow from locally to be able to repay microfinance loans when they can, but mostly nobody can repay it, and they're just stressed by it and by this accumulating interest. Next slide, please. And so then we try to understand, how do people cope with the gaps from the state and this confusing model of lending as a way of offering relief, and the stress of accruing interest. And what we found is that people try to find any small work that they can. People with livestock manage a bit, but across the board, what's happening is that people are pawning their gold jewelry, which is not uncommon in India, but what's happening now is that people are pawning even the small last bits of jewelry left without a way to reclaim them, because there's no possibility of a regular income for at least the next year for migrant workers who can't return. And they have also this accumulating debt to their employers, and so they might be, in some cases they were able to borrow a little from them, as they normally do, to cope, but because they are not going to work, this is also difficult. People who have land documents, collateral, they are able to borrow, but across the board, people are stressed for food, people are stressed by credit, and because of the responsibility of cooking food and servicing micro-lending debt falls on women, this anxiety is strongly gendered. Next slide.
I'm going to ask you to conclude this presentation, please.
So the next slide is the conclusion.
Oh, brilliant.
And so just to quickly say that in the context of this absence of micro lending, and then by private institutions, and then the state lending reaching only very few and the better off women, we ask for us to say something about the role of credit now and the role of credit long term in its relationship to resilience. Is that what we're seeing is the fact that they only lend to people with assets, and only the people who are better off are able to manage and repay and not become overburdened by it. Is the fact that resilience is actually a precursor to being able to use credit. So credit is not a good solution for the vulnerable. And so in this context, the decline of state relief in crisis ordinary and crisis now speaks to the fact that we need support that goes beyond credit. We see that informal lending, to some extent, is there's some amount of reciprocity and some amount of support that does happen, but there's also this informal lending against assets and expensive informal lending, and as we said, that this is a crisis that has a gendered impact in terms of how it's felt. And can I have one moment?
You have to round up, but yes.
It's very quickly to say that we have a long list of presenters on our list of authors of our paper. So I just want to quickly acknowledge that everyone's been doing a lot of work for this, but also we have a lot of people who've been doing the phone interviewing and transcription, and so we want to say that, and also people who've been speaking to us in the middle of this crisis for half an hour, 40 minutes, explaining to us about what they're going through, and so we want to acknowledge also that their time is what allowed us to do this.
That is very important. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a very, very interesting presentation. I already see questions popping up. I have some questions myself, but we'll save those to the end. Yeah, thank you so much. We're going to go straight into our next presentation. Sonia, are you ready to present your paper? We have slightly changed the presentation order due to some Wi-Fi issues with one of our panelists. So that's why Sonia was supposed to be last, but now she's going to be our second presenter. Let's see. I will see if I can see. Sonia, are you happy to present? Right, and let's see. I cannot hear you right now. Could hear you before.
It's on mute. Can you unmute? Yeah.
No, I still cannot hear you. Do you want to try to log in, log out, and log in again?
It might be the volume. Do you want to try the volume? Because everything else seems to work.
I think we've all had similar. No, I cannot hear you now. Sorry, I can see your lips maybe. No, sorry.
I'm going to try and mute and unmute. Let me just try that. Turn the volume up.
Let's see.
Ah, yes. I heard something.
Sorry, Sonia, I'm afraid that we cannot hear you. Can you try to log out and then click the panelist link and log in again? Right, otherwise I see that Salimah is back, so otherwise we'll throw around it again and we're just gonna make this work. I'm hoping that our next conference is gonna be in person so we can see each other and have these really important coffee discussions after all the sessions, but for now we're gonna make it work. We're just gonna give her a minute. While we're doing that, I just want to remind people that you can ask questions on the Q&A button in the bottom of your Zoom window, and we are going to take them in the end. If we don't have time to cover all of the questions, then our panelists will still see the questions and they will either be able to answer you in an email or maybe post on the discussions forums that we have. Right. Let's see what happens. Okay, I think we're gonna start. Salimah, are you happy to present? Are you back with us and happy to continue your presentation?
He's on mute again.
I'm fine to continue.
Perfect. Let's do that, and we'll continue with your presentation. Happy to have you back with us. So you were talking about how Cuba had adapted the, what's it called, the intro?
So I'll pick up from there. Interferon alpha 2b is one of 569 drugs that are used in the Cuban health system, and 60% of the total drugs used in Cuba are produced locally. So this is a huge productive endeavor. It involves 21,000 workers starting at the PhD level and moving down into other skill areas. There are also medications that are exported to 49 countries around the world. All of this is within a decommodified universal healthcare system in Cuba, which is rooted in prevention. So I talk about this as potential because my feeling in March was that with the immense devastation of COVID-19, there would be impetus globally for renewed public health care. And in Africa, such a system like Cuba's would deal with a host of health and social problems, starting from dealing with historic trauma, going to questions of unemployment, and to people-oriented manufacturing. What do we have in reality? You know, what is happening on the ground? Let me take South Africa and its healthcare system, which is a sheer contrast to what I've just described about Cuba. So what we have in South Africa is a monopoly structure in the entire health industry. What this looks like is that there are 4 companies that dominate the entire health supply chain. Let me give you a couple of examples. We have Afrocentric Investment Corporation. It owns companies in managed care. So this is the private health insurance. It owns a health insurance brokerage. It owns pharmacies. It owns pharmaceutical and medical technology manufacturing outfits. And it also owns the distribution of medical products. Another company, Remgro Limited. Remgro has ownership of medical schemes administration. So again, the administering of the healthcare insurance, managed care, another branch of that activity, Mediclinic, which is a chain of clinics that are all private, and 3 major hospital groups. There are 2 companies, Life and Netcare, which managed to use its market control to even avoid being studied by government's actual study of the healthcare industry. And so all of this data has been revealed through a study called the Health Market Inquiry of the Competition Commission of South Africa. There is a proposal called the National Health Insurance in South Africa, which is South Africa's version of universal health coverage. Basically, the NHI, for short, leaves this entire monopoly structure untouched. So the model of the health insurance is called in the literature the purchaser-provider split. It means that the state will buy services and goods to provide universal health coverage from these companies and all the subsidiaries that I've mentioned just now. A couple of days ago, South Africa took its first loan from the World Bank Group. It has received the largest loan so far, a total of $4 billion for COVID relief. And that too is going to follow suit within this monopoly structure of the healthcare industry. If we look at Ghana, we see an example. As Ghana has spent its loan, COVID-19 loan from the World Bank Group of $10 million on high-tech healthcare. So this is the types of private healthcare that are being spent on through this loan money. So it's everything from drones by a company called Zipline, a price control system of pharmaceuticals through a private company called M-Pharma, telemedicine. There are apps to track symptoms. The company there is Redbird. And moving toward greater monopoly control, what has happened in Ghana since January is that 3 of the big companies working in the pharmaceutical industry in Ghana, all of which are not from Ghana, have merged. So it is now the largest pharmaceutical provider in the country. So this again is universal health coverage based on the purchaser-provider split. We know from experiences in Europe and even North America that the purchaser-provider split does not make for less cost. But that is the model that is being promoted by the World Health Organization, the intergovernmental bodies, and so on. That is the difference, I would say, between universal health coverage and universal health care. I won't go into that now since time is limited. Let me move on to the last section. I want to move from the productive sphere to the financial. I think we have a tendency as thinkers and as activists to focus on what is happening materially. So the P3s that I've just described, or the purchaser-provider split,
5 minutes.
Or nepotism. So the kinds of corruption that happen when government, say, contracts out services. We've just had a couple of such cases emerging in South Africa with regard to personal protective equipment. We focus on those. We focus on the structural adjustment programs that decimated public health care in much of Africa. But I want to insist that we underestimate the shape and form of financialization in Africa. And that is the slippery slope that most of the continent has been on for some decades, and which South Africa is now entering. Here's some numbers. Between 1970 and 1996, for every dollar borrowed in the continent, 80 cents flowed outward in capital flight at the hands of African elites. So Ndikumana and Boyce said in 2003 that this suggests that external borrowing directly financed capital flight. Another estimate is of capital flight and accumulated interest held in these offshore accounts, which is where the money flies to, by the mid-1990s amounted to 145% of the total external debt owed in East, Western, and Southern Africa. So what that means is that Africa is a net creditor in the world financial system, again, though, what we tend to focus on is debt. So the extent of the external debt and the austerity that comes from that. And African governments are especially good at this. Their focus will be, well, we have to cut healthcare funding because we owe money, and these are the conditions of loans to keep on paying the debt and accumulating debt. So these numbers, I want to close with, put the debt austerity cycle, put the low levels of healthcare spending, and put the flat trend in tax collection of the rich and of multinational corporations in Africa in the last 30 years in a different light. And I want to insist that we urgently need to shift our focus to the role of African elites in impoverishment of the continent. So how do we reach the potential that I talked about earlier through the Cuban case of interferon alpha 2B? Well, it would take a massive mobilization of people, unions, all other forms of organization in the continent. And to put it the way that Samir Amin would have said it, to mobilize people toward a delinking, which would allow for energies in the continent to be refocused to productive activity that has social benefit. Amidst COVID-19, it is very difficult to imagine this mass mobilization. I read a quote yesterday in a news article from a migrant worker living in an informal settlement just outside of Johannesburg, who said, "We are so hungry we could eat the crust of a wound." We have a situation as the pandemic is only beginning to surge in Africa, where already 10,000 health workers have been infected with COVID-19. And we have the situation of paralysis, where African people are finding it difficult to not be able to meet, to not be able to touch, to not be able to smile. You know, these are the bases of creating mobilization. People are starving from the inability to do that. And so the question of the sequel is a very wide open one, given the devastation of this pandemic, which we are only beginning to see in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Amazing presentation. Also that you were able to come in again despite this break. That was, it was really, really good. Thank you so much. I got a little bit lost there in the end. It's very, very interesting. We're gonna have a final speaker, and we're going straight in. So Sonia Cerón, we're hoping now that we can get the mic to work. Can you say something?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh,
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. That's great.
So just tell me next, and I will press the presentation for you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, well, hello everyone. I'm very happy to share this analysis in this panel. My presentation has 3 parts. First, I present my interdisciplinary proposal, the stratified emergentist Polanyian perspective. Second, I present an initial analysis of the impact of COVID-19 on the economy of the lower income families, Bogotá families. And finally, I present the conclusion. Next. Okay. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a historical moment where it is possible to observe causal mechanisms such as inequality operating more openly within particular economies. In market-led economies, supported by reciprocity and redistribution, it is a challenge to find possibilities for the design and implementation of redistributive public policies to alleviate lack of income and ensure access to food, housing, education, health services, and environmental equality. In the case of Latin America, and in particular Colombia, the pandemic doesn't appear to be challenging the institutionalized economy. I will explore this observation with my interdisciplinary proposal. I will present how, during the pandemic crisis, causal mechanisms such as inequalities and clientelism interact with one another and are activated by passive and active me, contributing to the apparent persistence of the pre-pandemic institutionalization of the economy. I offer an initial analysis of the pandemic, and a long-term analysis will be necessary and complementary. What is the stratified Polanyian perspective about? This is a relational approach consisted of an understanding of a stratified reality where the institutionalization of the economy is an emergent arrangement resulting from the interplay of causal mechanisms operating from the structural and cultural dimensions and agential mediation. This approach analyzes the specific mechanisms which explain the possibility for adjustment of or not of the system, of a social system. I initially developed the stratified emergentist Polanyian perspective to resolve the difficulties that orthodox and heterodox schools of thought have faced explaining the economy of the family. This middle range theory offers a proposal to address the explanation of the economy of the family as it exists in concrete context. I underscore 5 main characteristics of this proposal. First, goes further than the empirical level to an open and stratified understanding of the reality. Second, doesn't elide what is to be known with how it can be known. Third, analyzes from a stratified understanding of the human being. Fourth, gives an emergentist grounding for the understanding of relations. And fifth, uses a broader understanding of the economic than the market. My proposal embeds core Polanyi's original proposal in critical realism, connecting through Donati's relational sociology. Polanyi's proposal of the economy as an instituted process, being understood as a process of relational emergence. Critical realism offers the ontology to understand social phenomena as emergent relationally within a stratified reality. And Donati, an Italian critical realist sociologist, offers the key clue with a non-transactional relational perspective. The instituted process of the economy is one such relational emergent phenomenon, and this understanding makes it possible to explain the economy of the family in particular contexts. The explanation of factors conditioning the emergence and combination of the economic relations of the family is possible by integrating Archer's morphogenetic morphostasis approach. I use 3 main elements of the morphogenetic approach. The possibility of explaining a social phenomenon through the structure, culture, and agency. Second, analytical dualism. And third, the stratified model of people. These elements advance the treatment of the structure and agency relation and avoid conflation between the two. The stratified model of people augments the stratified emergentist meta theory of critical realism and provides a way to explain people's emergent properties. Okay, next. Now let's move to the analysis. For the present analysis of the COVID-19 impact, I choose from the structural dimension inequality in a number of dimensions. From the cultural, I explore administrative corruption. And finally, from the agential dimension, I discuss the active and passive me. My intention is to give insights to understand the impact of the COVID-19 on the economy of lower income Bogotá families. I use the available public data and information from majority academic sources and national and international newspapers. Next. From the structural dimension, afterwards I will discuss the cultural and finally the agential dimension. In Colombia, a significant causal mechanism operating from the structural dimension is inequality. I have chosen inequality in a number of dimensions due to their importance during the coronavirus contingency. Let me start with income inequality. I will link it to income vulnerability and informality in employment, which has made it difficult to implement the lockdown. People without a proper labor contract can lose their income easily. It is the case of people working in the gig economy. They must go out to search for daily income. This is the map of coronavirus positive cases in Bogotá for the 27th of July, 2020. We're coming into the more difficult weeks of the pandemic. This map shows the impact by locality. The localities with higher number of COVID-19 positive cases have more households classified in the lower income levels. In Colombia, we have a socioeconomic classification called socioeconomic strata from 1 to 6. The lowest income households are classified in stratum 1 and the highest income families in stratum 6. The first two localities, Kennedy and Bosa, have more households classified in 2 and 3 strata. The third locality, Ciudad Bolívar, have 61% of households classified in stratum 1. Next, between 2009 and 2016, Colombia was either the most unequal country in Latin America or the second most unequal. Colombia's level of income inequality has been above countries such as South Africa in recent decades. Graph 1 shows the income share of the top 1% of the population over time in Argentina, Colombia, South Africa, and US. Based on the Colombian household survey of 2019, 20% of the top income households get 10 times the income of the 20% in the bottom income households. An important aspect that I want to highlight is the relation between household income vulnerability due to the contingency and informality in employment. Informality is high in Colombia. In the case of Bogotá, 24% of the workers don't have a formal working contract, and their income is 23% of the total income of workers in Bogotá. The Observatory of Economic and Social Situation of Universidad de los Andes classified the economic sectors according with their vulnerability during the pandemic crisis. The possibility of remote work determined the level of vulnerability. The sectors with lower levels of vulnerability are the ones in which it's possible to work remotely. They calculate a relation between this classification and informality of employment. Their calculation shows a direct relation between sectors with higher levels of vulnerability and higher numbers of workers without a formal working contract. Also, it is important to mention that they find that lower income households have higher participation in their income of working activities developed without a formal working contract. This observatory also calculated the relation between qualification level and working in more vulnerable sectors. The relation is lower education level, more participation in the sector with higher levels of vulnerability. Persons with just primary education are more likely to be working in an activity classified in the more vulnerable sector. Meanwhile, a person with an undergraduate degree is more likely to be working remotely, meaning in the sector with lower level of vulnerability. In graph 2, the evolution of the Gini coefficient of labor income shows a small reduction, but remains the highest in Latin America. Bogotá's Gini coefficient of labor income shows an improvement between 2012 and 2016. The group of macroeconomic studies of Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá estimated the variation of the Gini coefficient from 0.51445 in 2019 to 0.5941 after the pandemic. The calculation is based on the possible job and income losses over the income of households during the pandemic crisis. The conclusion of their document is that Colombia will face similar inequality in income as the one calculated for the beginning of the 20th century. Next. There have been efforts to address this historical inequality, but they have not been successful. These efforts have often been limited to targeted programs of subsidies, which don't reach a significant proportion of the population, but that provide some political visibility. The current government of Iván Duque is extending these targeted programs for emergency cash transfers at the national level. From this level, the main program is Ingreso Solidario, Solidarity Income. The national government included a bigger group of vulnerable people through this program. The transfers are $47 per month. At the local level, the Bogotá district government is also following the targeted programs of subsidies. They created a program of cash and food transfers, Bogotá Solidaria en Casa, Solidarity at Home, and Renta Solidaria. The majority of Claudia López used the survey of gig economy workers of the National Institute of Statistics of 2018. They have been encouraging gig economic workers not registered to do it through the webpage of the Institute of Social Economy. They are also developing a program to be launched in August of formalization of small companies. The majority raised resources inviting the citizens and companies to donate. Also, the majority issued 10-year debt bonds. Gender inequality is great in the lower and middle income population. A report by United Nations Development Program highlights the disadvantages of women, but compared to men, are related to belonging to the privileged or non-privileged groups. The report analyzes available data and finds poverty, exclusion, and marginalization in the group of women in non-privileged groups. Gender violence has increased during COVID-19 pandemic. 34 cases of femicide were reported during the first 3 months of the lockdown, March to May, 3 more than all the ones during the same period in 2019. The district government has used the purple phone line, Women Can Phone, to this line to denounce gender violence. There has been an increase in the weekly phone calls from 942 to 3,109, and an increase of 18% in claims regarding inter-household violence. On the care economy, women in Bogotá were in disadvantaged positions since before the COVID-19. Data from the District Oversight Office shows that women spend double time in care activities at home. For example, providing food for the family members, women spend 1 hour and 48 minutes in average. Meanwhile, men spend 56 minutes. Other example is physical care activities. Women spend 1 hour and 29 minutes and men spend 52 minutes. And in cleaning activities, women spend 1 hour and 17 minutes and men 51 minutes. Another important impact is over women working in health services, which increases contagious risk. For example, 85% of nurses who got their diplomas between 2001 and 2018 are women. In the case of bacteriologists, 92% are women. But there are other economic activities classified within vulnerable sectors in which there are more women working. For example, cleaning services. Also, it's usual that women have to find ways to generate income when there is a job lost in the family. This increases the number of hours women dedicate to economic activities. However, women's salary in Colombia is in average 12% less than men's salaries. Okay, now from the cultural dimension, I want to refer to administrative corruption. Specifically, I open the question of the presence of administrative corruption. And so in Colombia, it's persistent. Administrative corruption is persistent in public contracts assignation. This practice has been more profitable than drug trafficking, taking into account that there is no market competition in this activity. And
5 minutes left.
Okay.
Thank you.
And thus doing it may avoid being punished. The practice is extensive across all Colombia, with Bogotá being where there are the most possibilities to be discovered. I am going to present this mechanism for the national government due to data availability. Universidad Javeriana Tax Observatory analyzed public declaration and public documents from the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit regarding the resources and expenditure related to the state of emergency decreed during the pandemic. They concluded that there is no transparency in the information of state budget and its spending for the COVID-19. From the total announced budget to cover the pandemic expenses, which is 11% of the GDP, the observatory team just could identify clearly 1.7%. An example of this is in declaration, the spending in health system is 7.1 billion Colombian pesos. Meanwhile, there is just information of 0.92 billion Colombian pesos. This team also analyzes the 4 billion Colombian pesos, 0.37% of the GDP transferred from the national government to cover the pandemic expenses. The observatory team could identify just half of this amount of money for cash transfers programs, and the rest, they couldn't identify it. According with this analysis, there is just clear public information about this 2 billion Colombian pesos. This amount represents 51% of the total resources transferred and the 1.7% of the total budget approved to cover the contingency expenditures. It's important to mention that during the middle of June, the limit for the government deficit was eliminated for 2 years, 2020 and 2021. What have been the responses of the people? Next. The responses from lower income families are basically at the individual level. The first reaction to the lockdown and repression from the police was violent clashes. There have not been collective action taken. Gig economy workers go to the streets to try to get an income. It's frequent to read comments like, either I die because of the coronavirus or because I'm starving. Colombia has a cultural heritage of violence and repression of collective action. The Observatory of Democracy found that there is a decrease in the levels of trust in others during the COVID-19 pandemic. The observatory found that in Colombia, trust in others decreased from 30% in March to 12% in May and came up 20% in June. The comparison between stratum 1 and 6 is a decrease from 22% to 10% in stratum 1 and from 52% to 10% in stratum 6. The observatory highlights how the release of the lockdown impacted the trust in others, making harder two things. First, the collective care measures, such as using a mask or keeping a safe distance, and also making harder a possible collective answer. The national government proposed to suspend the charge of the VAT. This proposal looked to support the commerce sector. It was a disaster. In Bogotá, the majority made preventive shutdowns in some supermarkets due to the overcrowded and non-implementation of biosecurity measures. For the second day, the suggestion was to apply the rule just for online shops. Finally, I want to highlight the proposal of a group of senators from different political parties, fundamentally from center and left political positions. This group is presenting the project for the creation of the emergency basic income to replace Duque's national program. This program is looking to increase the monetary transfers to make it equal to Colombian minimum wage, $250 per month. There is a tension between the government and progressive representatives in the Congress regarding the state budget and its distribution. The government has discarded a task progressive reform, and the vice president has declared that people would like everything for free. Meanwhile, progressive representatives are presenting redistribution as a mechanism to use the state resources to satisfy the needs of the citizens. The citizens considered owners of the resources of the state. And finally, concluding next, this analysis of the impact of COVID-19 using the theory I presented has drawn our attention to four important things. First, the COVID-19 contingency has so far deepened pre-existing inequalities and the responses from the government haven't been able to prevent this. Second, there has not been collective action able to push the government towards bigger redistributive programs, which could meet the lower income families' needs during the pandemic. Third, the data available suggests that responses from lower income families remain in the individual level, which makes it harder to challenge the deepening of the pre-existing inequalities. Fourth, reduction in trust in others impact the possible emergence of solidarity. This contributes to the individualization of coping strategies, which likely has remained at the family level. When further data is available, the inclusion of other causal mechanisms will enrich this analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Let me stop sharing the screen. All right. So let me see. And now everyone is back. Fiorella has joined us for the Q&A. We have run over time slightly due to some technical issues. So we will start with one question for each presenter, and then we'll see where we are in time. The first question is a very long question to our first presenters. I'm gonna give you guys, can you guys see the question? Brilliant. So I would like our first presenter to answer that. We have questions for that's been mailed from the other presenters. The first one is for Sonia, our last presenter. You're talking about how there has been a fall in trust. How do you think this is related to the structure of Colombia's economy, and what impact is this going to have on long term? Also, what could be done to overcome this issue, if you have any thoughts about that? Let me see. There was another question mail here for Salimah. You've been talking about the case for Cuba as the sort of now I forgot the word you're using, but sort of the positive way. And then in your paper, you're writing that South Africa is likely to take the lead on the African continent in combating COVID. You opened up some really big questions in the end, but where do you see that you currently have done really well, and how could this be taken and sort of replicated further? So if we start with Nithya, and then we go with Salimah and then Sonia to answer these questions, please.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So as you say, it's a long question, and I think I can just try quickly to answer it. And basically, what we're looking at is looking at self-help groups are what are registered with the government of Tamil Nadu, with Tamil Nadu Corporation for Women's Development, and what you're looking at is microfinance. Private microfinance is by what is registered as non-banking financial companies, and this is how they are all are registered entities. And so, what we think broadly, the concern is that people receiving credit from any source, who are often wage workers in these contexts, they're all microfinance borrowers, are migrating to work in brick kilns, migrating to sugarcane fields. So this idea of being able to invest in a productive enterprise, it doesn't exist. And so this is the problem, that reaching credit as a solution, credit for enterprises solution to women like this is always a problem, and especially now. And the moratorium was accessed by people who couldn't afford to pay, but But some people were even pushed not to access the moratorium by other microfinance borrowers in their group, because if one person doesn't repay, then the other members of the group are liable to pay for them when the moratorium ends. And so we should say that this also this structural design of structural feature of microfinance makes it dangerous. That and so some people may be less able to utilize it because of their neighbors putting pressure on them as equally as the loan officers or anyone else.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Salimah, are you happy to answer your question?
Sure, I can do that. I may have misunderstood the question. I believe it is that South Africa has been leading in the combat of COVID-19 in Africa, and what are the lessons that can be taken. So the response in South Africa has been a combination of one of the strictest lockdowns in the world, a range of paltry supports that haven't actually reached business or workers or families, and in which migrant workers, undocumented people have been completely excluded. And that is where that quote that I mentioned at the end of my presentation comes in. Within this paltry support package, there has been nothing allocated toward care, which I think has just been mentioned by Sonia as a major area of labor, which women have been performing at 3 and 4, 5 times the intensity that they usually do during the pandemic. All of this support has been a mere shifting of allocated funds from the existing budget. So nothing has been done in addition, and things have been taken away in order to provide these paltry supports. There has not been any type of tax imposed on the very rich, which we've just seen in Sonia's slides, is quite a rich layer in South Africa. In fact, what government has done is requested corporations and rich individuals for solidarity during the crisis. And this is what has, for example, led to the building of a field hospital in Johannesburg by a major automotive multinational. But we will not tax these companies, which would really be, as Pravat Patnaik said in the last session, the beginning of solutions. South Africa has also refused to do any quantitative easing, which many countries of the South have done during the pandemic. And of course, we know the rich countries have done this heavily. So my view is that South Africa is not leading. We are now at a point of saturation in the hospitals and other places of care for people. We are still surging in terms of numbers. Today we are at, I had this, which I wanted to present earlier. We're at 482,169 COVID cases with just under 8,000 deaths to date. NIHAU, a major healthcare union in the country, has done an in-depth study of hospitals, and it has found, one of the things it has reported is that 18 hospitals just 18 hospitals in the entire country are submitting their weekly statistics on COVID-19. All of those are public hospitals. So we're talking about South Africa, a country where the intensive care beds are held in majority in the private sector. None of those hospitals are reporting on COVID-19. So the numbers of unstated additional deaths that have occurred in South Africa in the past few months are reaching 20,000 per month. And this is in comparison to previous years. So these are not deaths that are related, that are labeled COVID related, but we can infer that they are COVID related because they are that much higher than what is typical in this month and in these months and in this season in South Africa. There are a number of things that could have been done differently, as in most countries, and I've written about this, but South Africa has done none of them. So I'll stop there, and if I have misunderstood your question, please do let me know.
Thank you so much. Sonia?
Okay, thank you. Trust in others. If you see there's an impact from the COVID-19 and there's a reduction during the lockdown, this observatory highlights how the measures of distancing are impacting this trust in others. And if you can see, I wanted to highlight how people belonging to stratum 6, higher income families, they trusted more in others in proportion than in the case of families classified as stratum 1, lowest income families. The differences are 30%. So, and reduced. If it's historical, that's why precisely I do develop a model, a theory in which I'm relying on this historical, and not just historical, is this instituted process of Polanyi, but also is an emergence of these different mechanisms being activated by people. So in this moment, looks like people is activating more this untrust in others. Bogotá is a very sad place at the moment. There are lots of people in the streets looking to get something to eat. So it's very, very difficult, and also that lots of robbery. How I think this can be challenged. There are cases in Colombia in which violence in communities and collective action has been possible through the intervention of international law. So it's not locally, unfortunately. It's very difficult, and we have a very high level of murders of social leaders all across Colombia. So they are not stopping during the pandemic crisis. Is the same. I am from the southern Colombia in Cauca. That is one of the departments with highest levels of violence and against social leaders. So I do think it's very difficult, and it's also a global, like, pushing towards individual answers. And that's why I study the family, because in Colombia the family is a very important structure where you can go and ask for help, and probably you will find it. But then if you find it there, you will not move to look for something more bigger, So that's something that is a kind of a paradoxical situation. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I've been given a couple of other questions, and I'm going to try to summarize them to one question because we have some limited time left, but it is a sort of question, some general questions on. We are sadly in a lot of places looking at a second wave. So we're sort of we are all in different positions in this sort of phase of COVID. But it looks like a lot of countries have experienced the first hit and that there will be a second. From each of your analysis, is there anything we can sort of generalize and take with us to adopt for a second wave? Should we do the same way again? Nithya, if you want to start.
I think for Tamil Nadu, as in, I think it's very much the first wave and not looking like it's yet plateauing or and I think so. I think it's, but I think the kind of things that could be done is looking at more cash transfers, more food support, looking at what, how long is the non-COVID healthcare going to be suspended by the state? So what's going to happen to all other healthcare, and then also looking at this question of how are we going to deal with the accumulating interest. So if this continues to go for another 4 or 5 months, the amount people are paying double the value of their loan while they keep it paused. So can we call upon microfinance institutions that are supposed to be helping poor women to bear some of the burden of this and waive interest, not just delay?
Sorry, thank you. Salimah?
Okay, thank you. I'll just pick up from where I left off on South Africa. Another thing that hasn't happened in South Africa is a nationalization of the health, of the private health industry. And we know that this has happened in Spain and other countries. That has been limited to the duration of the pandemic, which of course hasn't ended, as you're saying. But I think that that is a measure that we all need to think about for the long term. We need to nationalize these private industries that have been making high profits on the back of people's health for several decades. And we need to redirect everything that has been built up in those industries by workers, by knowledge workers, and the range of others, by healthcare providers, for the use of the majority. We need to not only think about a second wave or a third wave of COVID-19, which we do expect to happen, and more, right? We expect other viruses to arise because we have been destroying the ecology. We've been extracting and moving into zones where there are viruses that would have never reached us had we been a bit more respectful. So we need to think about socializing healthcare, no matter what type of economy a country finds itself in at the moment. Now, on the smaller scale, to deal with this particular pandemic or others that will arise, what I've suggested for South Africa are measures which would lead us into the path of a socialized healthcare system. So, for example, we could take the millions of unemployed youth, and this could go for other countries as well, and train them in prevention education about the pandemic. What we have seen in the South, and to a lesser extent elsewhere in the world, is actually force trumping care. So in a healthcare crisis, we have seen force trumping care. Let's shift that around. Let us build up care. So, as I'm saying, you could educate unemployed people in prevention, in even food preparation, delivery of food, so that people can be supported to fight the pandemic and take on the measures that we're told to take on. We need measures that will cover women who are having to quit their jobs in order to provide the care resulting from the pandemic, provide the teaching resulting from the closure of schools. We need support for them, and that has not been considered in any country.
No. Thank you so much. We only have 1 minute left, so I would normally not. I'm gonna let you speak as well, Sonia. It would normally not be this strict, but because we have the AGM after, and I'm the secretary, so I have to be there. I'm just gonna ask for a short comment from you, Sonia.
Okay, now I just want to say that we also are just coming into the first wave.
Yeah.
And I do think we need, as academics and researchers, to keep doing further research in what is causing the social systems that we are facing, and why, you know, like we have to explain why, and keep feeding that research and feeding theory to be able to explain these real concrete economics.
Yeah.
Economists, sorry. Yeah, that's it.
I know this is it's a tough time. It's challenging, and it's challenging in different ways for all countries. But one thing that really motivates me is seeing these kind of work from all over the world, hearing your guys' presentations, seeing your analysis, seeing your recommendations on how to build again and build better. I think I agree with you, Sonia. I agree with what the sort of the inspiring presentation you all made. Thank you so much. I want to remind everyone that we have a discussion forum. If you want to, your papers will be uploaded to our website, and we can continue these discussions and provide feedback on these discussion forums. We will have our AGM later today, so if you're a member and if you want to be part, I have sent out the Zoom link to everyone who's a member of the Heticon membership list, and I hope to see many of you there later. But for now, I'm going to stop this session. Thanks again to our panelists, and hope to see you at a future conference in person.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Sonia.